I'm the coordinator for Science in the City, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Academy this evening. Tonight's panel is going to be really awesome. We have Dr. Ernst Fehr, Professor of Microeconomics and Experimental Economics at the University of Zurich, and Dr. Rolf Pfeifer, Professor of Computer Science at the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, also at the University of Zurich. And our moderator this evening is Dr. Maria Konikova. She's a science writer who contributes regularly to The New Yorker, as well as a number of other prestigious publications. It'll be fantastic, and just before we get started, I'd like to briefly thank the Zurich Meets New York Festival for their partnership in this event. The festival is going on through May 23rd, and it involves a ton of great events throughout the city on arts as well as science-related subjects. There are flyers in the rack in the back and also in the lobby, so I invite you to pick those up and peruse them for a complete schedule of the festival's offerings. And with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Fischer, the President Emeritus of the University of Zurich, to make some remarks.
Thank you very much. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to be here and to speak to you in this wonderful location and to be able to present to you today's program, presented or offered to you by the University of Zurich. It is part, as you've heard, of the Zurich Meets New York Festival, a festival in which Zurich, Switzerland's biggest city, will present itself to a US audience, not only as perhaps many people think, a city of banking and finance, but as a city of ingenuity, where ideas were generated in the past and are being generated now, ideas that may change the world in different ways. Today's evening is sponsored by the University of Zurich, one of the 4 partners in this enterprise. Let me mention the others. One is the Consulate General of Switzerland here in New York. The other one is the City of Zurich. The third one is the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and the fourth is the University of Zurich. Let me say a few words about the university. It is Switzerland's second oldest, founded in 1833, and is by far the largest in terms of student numbers, with 26,000 students in all, 4,000 of which are doctoral students. The University of Zurich is a comprehensive university, subdivided into 7 faculties: theology, law, economics, medicine, veterinary medicine, arts and social sciences, and science. And what we are bringing to you today comes from the faculty, or comes from the humanities. And our motto, in fact, in this festival is sorry, I have to read this to you. Exploring humanity from the past to the future. In the humanities, we look at prehistoric human beings, but we also look at mankind today. And today's topic, as you can see, no, you can't see it. But as you see in the program, is what can robots and economics teach us about humanity? The 2 professors you have here on the panel are, on the one hand, Ernst Fehr, Professor of Economics, who is a behavioral economist who is teaching us a great deal about how human beings function in this respect. And the other one is Rolf Pfeifer, Professor of Robotics and head of our Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. The 2 will be interviewed by Maria Konikova, and I'm happy to welcome the 3 of you, and thank you very much indeed. And before I finish, let me thank you once again, the sponsors of all, in particular, the Consulate General of Switzerland, who's done a great deal to organize this festival here in New York. Thank you very much indeed.
Great. So thank you both for being here today. The way that we're going to do this is we're going to start with just a few questions that are individually addressed. First to Dr. Fehr and then to Dr. Pfeifer. And then we'll have a discussion with the 2 of them about some of the intersections of their work. And finally, we'll open it up to questions from all of you, which I'm sure you will have a lot of. So since we're going interdisciplinary here, let me begin my first question by adding yet another discipline and quoting back to you a quote that you used in one of your most cited papers, Fairness and Retaliation in 2000. So you quoted a passage from a 13th century Norse epic verse, the Edda. A man ought to be a friend to his friend and repay gift with gift. People should meet smiles with smiles and lies with treachery. And I think this really gets at some of the themes of your work of altruism, punishment, cooperation, and its evolution. So I'd like you to tell me a little bit about, why you chose this quote in particular, and also how you feel about it now, 15 years later.
Well, I still think it's a great quote because it describes a basic human tendency, and it fitted well to that paper that we wrote with the title Fairness and Retaliation. Because as an economist, we had a particular model of human behavior that most of you may have heard of. It's called the Homo economicus model, and in that model, the self-interest assumption features prominently, and the self-interest assumption implies that we don't care for fairness, but it also implies that we don't care too much. Let's say I don't care if some person in this room treats another person in this room badly because I'm not affected. So, and what we did in this work is to assemble the evidence that shows that humans have a tendency to reciprocate. They reciprocate in kind. So if I treat you nicely, you tend to treat me nicely as well. If I'm hostile to you, then you might hit back, or many of you will. And this human tendency to reciprocate is not just rooted in self-interest. So there is also a possibility to reciprocate in a self-interested way. So, for example, in business, if I do business and you pay your bill, I make a profit, you have a good product. So next time I give you the good again and you pay the bill, so we both benefit. But that's a kind of self-interested reciprocation. But what about if you don't pay me the bill? Okay, then you treat me in a hostile manner, and then I may go after you beyond what's in my self-interest. I may bring you to court, despite the fact that I may not, I may have hard time to prove that you did something wrong and things like that. So that's what I mean by reciprocation. So you go beyond self-interest. If somebody treated you kindly, you behave kind to that person, not because of self-interest, but because of a basic psychological impulse to show gratitude, for example. And, well, it has huge implications for economics, and that was the topic of this paper. I could go into this, but maybe for the sake of time, I don't at the moment.
Right. So what do you think, one of the themes in your work is the evolution of some of these tendencies. Can you talk a little bit about why altruism is evolutionarily adaptive, and also why you show in a lot of your work that even though it's adaptive, it's not very stable. It can be a very fragile state of cooperation. So.
Well, this has to do with reciprocity itself. If you, let's say, if we are in a situation where we both could cooperate, then there may be reasons that prevent you from reciprocating my cooperation. For example, maybe you had a bad business, you had bad luck, and because of bad luck you were not able to repay the bill. Or you had a health problem. So there are random events that prevent you to reciprocate. And now the question is, how do I interpret that? And if I just reciprocate, which means I treat you not paying the bill as a hostile act, and I start becoming hostile to you, then we get in a bad cycle. So we get into a bad cycle of non-cooperation. And one reason why reciprocity can lead to very good outcomes, but it can also lead to very bad outcomes. For example, war crimes are sometimes based on reciprocity. So people had injuries in their family, or they themselves got injured, And many atrocities in wars are acts of reciprocity, basically. So the reciprocity means that people can be much, much nicer than the self-interest hypothesis predicts, but they can be much, much worse than the self-interest hypothesis predict. And now the question comes up, why does this evolve in evolution? And this is still an ongoing debate. There's a dominant theory in evolutionary psychology, I would say, or among evolutionary scholars, which is the theory of reciprocal altruism, that this behavior emerged because of because it helped us in evolution to flourish, in a sense. But in our new work, we show that that is not necessarily true. So at an intuitive level, it makes a lot of sense to think, if you are nice to me, I'm nice to you. And so we cycle up and we establish cooperation. But it can also go the other way around. So it's in a sense fragile. Because random acts that lead to non-cooperation are reciprocated with non-cooperation, we go the other direction. And that means it is highly unstable. But let me still point out, because I feel the urge, let me point out some of the important implications for economics or for how our societies work. For example, the desire to punish wrongdoers. That's something deep in us, so to speak. And a lot of things a lot of institutions that exist are here, somehow to curb that desire, but are also here to support that desire. Or in economics, I give you one example that was important for me, unemployment, you see. One of the big problems in economics is that it's not so easy to cut wages for a company, because workers, the incumbents, they may reciprocate. They may respond to a wage cut with lower work effort. So they can punish. Workers have many opportunities to punish a firm by, for example, just sticking to the rules, but just to the formal rules and doing nothing extra. For example, in Italy, a famous way of non-cooperation by workers often were sticking just to the rules. You live up to the rules, but you don't do more, and it's very detrimental to the efficiency of organizations. So they can, and this is why firms shy away from cutting wages, but sometimes that would be necessary in order to clear the labor market, to bring workers back into employment. And so a part of unemployment is due to wage stickiness, and wage stickiness is partly due to the fact that reciprocity plays such a big role in the labor market. So that's just one of the implications for society.
So how can society work to minimize the downside? What do we know about humans from your work, both as a neuroeconomist and just as an economist?
Well, we have built institutions to get rid of the bad consequences of reciprocity. For example, private revenge is typically not allowed in our societies, but in more simpler societies, that's still very prevalent. So the legal principles that curb the impulse to reciprocate the negative side of reciprocity are very important. And all kinds of institutions, basically, that help us to curb reciprocity. By the way, we know, for example, you can be distinguished between two types of reciprocity. One is positive, so I'm kind if you're kind to me. Negative is I'm hostile if you're hostile to me. And the interesting thing is that these two things do not necessarily go together in the same person. So there seem to be some persons who tend to be negatively reciprocal, and some others who tend to be more positively reciprocal, which is and they also, that seems to be rewarded in the labor market, for example. When we have measures of positive reciprocity, these people tend to earn higher wages. Whereas negatively reciprocal people, they tend to be more unemployed, what we found. So why it makes a lot of sense. If you tend to interpret many things as hostile and then you respond in a hostile manner, that's not the employers want. But if you respond positively to, let's say, a gift by the employer, that's so voluntary, you're willing to cooperate voluntarily a lot, that's the kind of employers want. And so they are rewarded by the market, basically, with higher wages.
So one of the things I'm interested in your work is you do identify these kind of broad themes of why people cooperate and why they don't. And yet you also talk a lot about the individual variation and kind of the moment-by-moment factors that can throw everything that we know about kind of humans and human cooperation out the window. Mood can really influence how you're cooperating, poverty, even things like, I loved your work about chance events like Chernobyl, where you show that when you have a disaster like that, that really changes how people behave. Can you comment a little bit on that dynamic?
Yeah. So I come from economics, and we have a certain body of knowledge or way of approaching things. And one dogma in our discipline always was that we take people as they are. We take people as they are. We don't want to change people. And there's something very good about that, because ideologies that wanted to build a new world by changing people, communist ideologies, they utterly failed. But on the other hand, it's clear that the way we are, for example, our motives, our basic impulses, they are somehow shaped by society. So, for example, the ability to which we are able to persist despite failure, not giving up, or the ability to self-control our emotions. Let's say you don't get what you want, and some kids, when they don't get what they want, they become utterly angry, and they can't control their anger. And that means the way we are is shaped by society and by education. That's what I believe, and that's where we are increasingly collecting evidence. And that means my motives, they are shaped by society. And for example, we did the best things to detect such things. It's very hard. I mean, if you come from sociology, sociologists tell you society shapes people. And I always believed that. But it's very hard to prove. It's extremely hard to prove from a scientific viewpoint. Why? Because we cannot run an experiment where we randomly assign people to circumstances. You can't randomly assign children to their parents, you see? And therefore, you cannot have a control treatment and an intervention treatment. It's just impossible for ethical reasons. And so it is a very hard question. I call it, and this is why we have made very little progress in understanding how society shapes people. But now we have all the tools available. And so we start increasingly doing that. And this is one of my more recent research programs. And you raised the term Chernobyl. So what we did, for example, there is we examined to what extent did Chernobyl change people. And Chernobyl was a terrible event, but from a scientific viewpoint, it had a nice feature. And the nice feature was that radiation was randomly distributed over Ukraine and over Europe. It depends on the weather conditions, you see. And where the weather goes, it's random, basically. And so if you lived 50 kilometers away from Chernobyl, you might have gotten little radiation, but 200 kilometers away, you got a lot. And so it's a random event. And so now we have this natural experiment that radiation comes down randomly, except in the near vicinity of the catastrophe. And then 20 years later, we measured to the extent to which people take risks, are willing, what are people's risk preferences? What are people's preferences for savings, for delaying gratification, which is extremely important for a society, that we are able to delay gratification. And we have these maps, these radiation maps all over Ukraine. And we know where people lived in 1986. And now we can study. It's really fascinating from a scientific view, and we can study the impact of that event on what made it out of people. And what we find is that, in general, that people who were more exposed to radiation, they become much more kind of fatalistic. They are less willing to take risks. They're very risk averse, so I should say it in that way, because risk taking, when you think of New York and banks and Wall Street, you think it's something negative. But if you are very risk averse, that's also very negative. They are less willing to save. So by the way, they all believe they will die earlier. And now you might think, well, that makes a lot of sense. But you know, the radiation they got is what you get when you live one more year. It was basically nothing. It's all psychology. It's not that there's not any biological reasons why radiation has this impact. It just can't have. It's just the radiation impact for most of the people was just 1/2 year or 1 year of background radiation that you would anyway get when you live 1 year longer. So it's totally innocuous. And nevertheless, it had this impact. So it tells you, and it makes a lot of sense, because radiation, it's the fear. They live in the constant fear, and this constant level of this constant fear that something could happen, that they could have gotten something that shows up only 20 years later. That is our conjecture, that generated these differences in how people are willing to behave 20, 30 years later.
That's fascinating. So is it fair to kind of conclude, going to the theme of this panel, that one of the things that economics can teach us about humanity is that some of the choices that we think are, very rational and just part of of what we are and who we are really affected by some of these things that we don't even realize are affecting us? Is that a fair?
Well, I think economics can teach us much, much more. I think if I talk to a general audience, my main message is that economics is not about banks, it's not about tax, it's not just about the economy, the narrow economy. It's not just about making business. It's not just about earning money. It's not just about taxes. It's about improving education, reducing poverty. It's about a lot of noble things, and that's not how we perceive it. You see, when you look at the New York Times every day, then that's not what's on the economics page. But that's what economics is today too. You see, improving education, improving the world, basically. That's what we can learn from it.
So now let's start improving the world through robots. Can you tell me a little bit about just the idea of bio-inspired robots? What is it?
Okay. So traditionally, robots have been in factories behind walls. And if you're interested in sort of, and these robots are basically, whether you want to call them intelligent or not, is basically just arbitrary. But you can program all the details in there, they're very precise, and everything is predictable in that environment. Now, if you look at sort of truly intelligent systems like human beings, they live, apparently we live in very unpredictable environments. If you go out after the session here for drinks or something, you cannot sit here and think about the individual steps that you will be taking. It's a ridiculous thing, but you just go there and you react to the changes in the environment, right? Whereas in a factory environment, you can really pre-program everything down to the last detail. So apparently biological systems are equipped with abilities that these factory robots are not. And so it seems natural to get inspiration, to try as an engineer, to try and get inspiration from biological systems, because there are so many things that they can do so much better than what we can normally do in engineering. I mean, having said that, of course, if you look at individual capacities, you know, individual things like playing chess or, you know, doing arithmetic or, you know, even manipulation things, you will always find a machine that can actually do it better, the individual thing, but it won't be able to do like a combination of things. But then we really, I mean, if you look at what evolution has come up with, and you know, we talked about evolution before, then it's so fascinating, and I think we can learn a lot by looking at biology, and maybe we can build machines that can imitate some of these capacities.
So you've written that one of the things that you're doing is that you're kind of building cognition from the bottom up, rather than, and I loved the way that you phrased this, the brain chauvinistic model of the past, where you thought that, you know, it all came from top-down regulation. Can you tell me a little bit about that idea and how that differs from traditional robotics? So what are you doing differently?
Right. So I think one of the problems that we have is the Cartesian heritage. You know, I think, therefore I am. So it's basically everything is centrally controlled and sitting up here, and also you see people, you know, who are thinking, you know, they basically sit there like that, and, you know, it's happening up here. If you look at, again, at evolution, then what our brain that we have today and what we now call intelligence or thinking has always evolved as part of a complete organism that had to interact with the real world, survive in the real world, and reproduce in the real world. So if we want to understand what intelligence is, we have to understand what the role of the body is in this interaction. And mind you, the body is the only way in which we can actually interact with the environment. And so the idea emerged that actually the body, we need to study the role of the body. And the more you think about it, the more you see how crucial the role of the body is in the development of intelligent behavior. I mean, I can give you know, some examples. When I yes, I think there is an important principle that holds for any intelligent system, and that is that every action has, as a result, sensory stimulation. So, for example, when I walk, the environment travels across the visual field. Or when I grasp this cup here, I not only hold the cup in my hand, but through this physical action of grasping the cup, I am generating a pattern of sensory stimulation in the hand. I can feel the cup in the hand, and we have very rich, you know, very fine and very rich sensors. And this action, the result of this action, is a pattern of sensory stimulation. And these patterns of sensory stimulation that are generated through our physical actions are, so to speak, the raw material for the brain to process and to learn something about the environment. So it is in these interactions with the environment that we actually learn things about the environment. And another important thing is we have different kinds of sensors, so different sensory modalities. We have vision, we have, we can hear, we can touch things, and then we can learn over time to make predictions. So we can learn that by just looking at the cup, I already have an expectation of what it will feel like when I actually grasp the cup. And these expectations are extremely important. Also a concept of an object, you know, if we are sort of talking about higher level cognition, the concept of a concept, the concept or the idea of a concept is multimodal. So it's not only visual, but it's visual, haptic, and, you know, what you can basically do with the object. And then I think in the interaction with the environment, you can start building higher concepts or something like that. Also, we are equipped with proprioceptive sensors, that is, sensors about our own body. And every action that I make, for example, I make this action, I can feel the result of the action. And this helps me over time to master my motor control and to build something like what's called a body schema.
Mm-hmm. So how do you mimic this notion of expectation in a robot? How does a robot create expectations about the fact that a cup will always be the same? And how does it not mistake a rock for an egg or an egg for a rock?
Okay, well, it's a difficult question. I mean, the sort of having expectations in a robot is very easy. One of the advantages that we actually have in robotics over making experiments with humans is that we can record everything that's happening. We can record the motor signals, we can record the sensory stimulation, and then it's a completely transparent system, and we can analyze everything that's actually happening in the system. And I think that's an extremely powerful methodology if we can really study the details of the learning processes. We have, let's say, the important principle is that when we perform a motor action, a copy of this motor signal is sent to the brain, which then uses this copy to make a prediction about the expected sensory stimulation. Basically, I give a motor signal, I want to grasp this cup, I have the expectation, and then the sensory stimulation that results tells me whether my action has been successful or not.
So what about the famous egg problem of how you actually get a robot to know that this is an egg, this isn't a rock?
Well,
and how do you know?
To get it to know that this is an egg is actually very difficult. Normally, we basically tell the robot that it's an egg, but the sort of the benchmark is, always people say, well, can the robot handle a raw egg? And then, if it can, without breaking the egg, we say it's a good robot, and if it can, it's a bad robot. Now, I would like to actually maybe show you a brief video. Could we have the project? Oh, we already have it. Okay, it's very good. So, and this is a brilliant example of the role of materials. So it turns out that the body, basically, I talked about the importance of the role of the body in the development of intelligent behavior or in the evolution of cognition. Now, it turns out that about 85% of the material that our bodies are made of is soft. Only less than 15% of the body weight is actually the skeletal system. Whereas if you take classical robots in the factories, they're all hard and they have motors in the joints. Mm-hmm. Now, if we intend to replicate some of these abilities of human beings, for example, manipulation abilities or things like that, then we need to understand the mechanisms of soft systems. Classical control theory that engineers have been using and that has been very successful in factory environments doesn't work for soft systems. We have to think completely differently about control. And I think this to me is one of the best examples that demonstrates the power of materials. And grasping an object, is actually, if you want to build a robot that has a hand like a human hand, grasping is a relatively difficult task. But what these people do, the Jaeger-Lipson coffee balloon gripper, it's a very, very nice example. It was developed at Cornell University in New York. And if you go to the supermarket and you buy a pack of ground coffee, then the package is hard like a rock because of the vacuum, right? But if you open it, it gets really soft. So what they did, they took a balloon and they filled it with ground coffee, and then they added a vacuum pump. And then what they do is basically with this balloon, with the coffee, they just move it over an object, they lower it over the object, and because it's soft, it will passively deform and passively, without control from the brain, adapt to the shape of the object. And then they apply the vacuum and the structure hardens, and then they can grasp any object that they like, mind you, with one and the same control. So the adaptivity to the environment is delegated entirely to the periphery of the system. And it's extremely powerful. And also, well, let me show you this. I mean, it's really fun. I'll just give you a few examples here. It's really fun. I think this is brilliant work. And here, a completely different object, same control. And I once gave a talk. Oh, now you have to see. Now it's your question with the egg. So this is the raw egg. And, you know, same thing, same control,
It's
no
a good
problem.
robot.
You know, it can handle the raw egg. Now it's just a demonstration that actually it is the raw egg, yeah. You can see, well, it was a raw egg.
Bad robot.
So very good robot. Now, coming back to human beings, so this isn't really hard, but if you want to grasp a glass, you know, let's say a straight glass like this, for us it's very easy. We don't need to know the shape of the glass. We just apply a particular force, then the fingers, without knowing the shape of the object, will wrap around the glass, will adapt to the shape of the glass. Moreover, we have deformable tissue in the hand and on the fingertips. And when we do this, the tissue will automatically adapt to the shape of the object. It's not controlled by the brain. And because the skin is always a bit humid, it has the right frictional characteristics. So grasping a glass, I don't know whether we are going to have a reception afterwards where we have drinks. Are we? Okay.
Yes.
Then you can actually test the thing. Is very easy to grasp a glass. If you think about grasping a glass of that type with thimbles, metal thimbles on all the fingertips, it's next to impossible. And then you realize what the materials actually do for you.
So now you're talking about basically the robot learning from the environment and modifying its behavior without a lot of cognitive control, but doing very complex things. Now, you've also done some work in evolutionary robotics, which is kind of this concept, but at a much higher level. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. I'm not sure it's at a much higher level, you know, basically sort of low level people, but interested in sort of building cognition from the bottom up. Ultimately, I think that's the way to do it. And let me just, so one of the reasons we want to do it like that is the following. As engineers, we program a robot. But when we program a robot, we impose our own idea of how the robot should function onto the robot. And if our model isn't correct, it's not going to work. Mm-hmm. However, if I equip the robot with a learning mechanism and let the robot interact with the environment from its own perspective, it will learn the proper dynamics, right? It will learn the right thing. It will learn what is good for the robot, not what I think is good for the robot. And so I think that's very important. But coming back to just very quickly to evolution, now there is an area called evolutionary robotics. And the idea actually dates back to the 1960s. It was like there was John Holland in the United States and Ingo Rechenberg at the Technical University of Berlin. And Rechenberg was an engineer, and he was interested in evolution. And he said, well, evolution has come up with great designs like human beings. You know, we all think we're really great designs, right? And so his idea was, if we could imitate certain aspects of biological evolution on a computer, maybe we could come up with designs that people haven't thought about. So using simulated evolution as a designer. And I think it's an extremely powerful idea. Now, what most people do is they take a robot, they evolve a brain for the robot or a controller. Now, interesting things have been done like that, but it's very non-biological. You know, in biology, you don't have a body and then, you know, there's a brain evolved for the body, but you always have a co-evolution of the brain and the body, you know, simultaneously. And so we were interested in having brain-body co-evolution, and Josh Bongard was one of my former PhD students. He's now a professor in the US, and he developed a model of co-evolution of brain and body. And can I just briefly show this? So the story goes as follows. I mean, it's a bit complicated. He developed a model of genetic regulatory networks and embedded this into an evolutionary process. And he evolved a block pusher. And so basically only the task was given, push a heavy block. I mean, that's why I'm saying it's not really high level cognition. It's sort of pushing a block. But still, it's a difficult task. And that's all that he gave to the system. He said, you have to push the block as far as possible. And then we actually set up the simulation, and we went downtown for drinks and wanted to go back later to the lab. We had a few drinks too many, and so we didn't make it back to the lab in the same evening. We came back in the morning, and in the morning when we came back, this is what we had. This is what we actually saw.
In our first set of experiments, we evolved agents to push a large block in their environment as far as possible during a fixed time period. Here we see an agent growing from a single starting sphere into a set of connected spheres. These spheres are loosely modeled on biological cells, but also serve as the basic mechanical unit from which the agent is constructed. Each unit contains a complete copy of the genetic information shaping the growth of the agent, as well as sensors, motors, and neural structure. As these units grow and divide, so too does the neural structure grow inside the developing body.
So that's
the agent shown here was extracted from one evolutionary run after 2 hours. At this point, artificial ontogeny has discovered how to grow the brain and body of the agent together to achieve an inchworm method of locomotion. This agent is a descendant of the previous one and appeared in the evolving population after a further 2 hours had elapsed. Here, evolution has discovered that increased mass allows the agent to exert more force against the block. Also, the inchworm method of locomotion has been modified to create a long appendage that pushes against the block. White units contain both sensors and motors. Light gray units contain only sensors. The dark gray units contain only motors, and the black units are empty and only provide structural support. The combination of different...
Okay, I think we can probably stop here. I mean, the point is that, for example, the way this creature moves has not been programmed into the system, but evolution has discovered how to move. You know, so we have a process of, you know, mutation, selection, and simply using these mechanisms, we get this. Also, evolution discovered that if you have more mass, if you want to push a hard object, if you have more mass, you are more successful at pushing a heavy object. And so I think it's an absolutely fascinating thing. And we had these creatures, we showed them to the biologists, and they also were, you know, very excited about this. Okay, I think I can stop here.
Well, I think this is a really interesting way to return back to Dr. Fehr's work. And here you're showing, you know, a model of how a robot learns and evolves in the environment. And a lot of your work is about how humans kind of learn from their environment and how they learn based on different rules of social norms or kind of the rules that a society gives, which is a little bit different from, you know, the rules of pushing a block. So what do you think that you can use robots to study the types of evolution and learning that you talk about? Do you see a similarity between social norms and kind of rules of behavior, or do you think that that's not actually possible?
Well, social norms are a result of thousands or millions of interactions, and and they are selected. I mean, there is a subfield in evolutionary theory that's called the theory of cultural evolution, and that's exactly what happens in cultural evolution, that social norms evolve, that people start mimicking other people, and when you add cultural evolution to biological evolution, you can you enlarge the space of possibilities to a large extent. And by the way, some of the most prominent theories of human cooperation, they have a component of cultural evolution. And cultural evolution, personally, I believe that it's impossible to explain, for example, human altruism without some cultural evolutionary component. And it also, because it's, for various reasons, I mean, it has been, of course there is hardware in us and there are genes, but it's very hard to find, I would go as far as saying nobody has yet found a real genetic basis for human cooperation or human altruism. I mean, I have only tried to find it for the last 7 years, and I didn't find anything. Maybe we still go on, so we need to persist. But so the scope for genetics to affect human altruism is much lower than the scope of culture to affect human altruism. And when it goes so far as, for example, and these are very practical problems, by the way. For example, currently we talk a lot about banks in Switzerland, but also in New York and in the US, and about why could it happen that there's so many wrongdoers, so to speak. There are these banking scandals where people start cheating, and many people attribute that to the banking culture, to the culture that evolved in banks. And what is a culture? Culture is a system of social norms. And I think if you want to get things straight, you have to change these norms. They can do it, so to speak, by design, but evolution, or at the society level, it's much harder to do that. But also Western societies achieved it. I mean, if you look at the systems of norms we have in Western societies, just think about 2 examples. Gender norms relating to gender relations and norms related to smoking. If you look back 50 years, then you see how women and men interacted in 50 years ago was very, very different than it is from today, than it is from when you viewed it from today. But the same also relates to smoking. Nobody smokes here, okay? I guess 50 years ago, there would have been people in this room who started switching on their cigarette and starting to smoke. So because there's an anti-smoking norm that evolved in the last 30, 40 years that spread basically over all Western societies. It's an example of evolution that's fostered, of course, also by legal processes at some point. But initially, it's always the evolutionary process that triggers legal processes. Or very often it's like that. It's not the other way around. Yeah.
By the way, there is one smoker in here. Let me point out this roboy that...
That's right, yeah.
Yes, he has a cigarette in his mouth, and he's also drinking. He has a hard time standing, though. We know why. So do you want to comment on that, about kind of these cultural evolutionary factors, and whether you can see kind of robotics moving in that direction and having kind of, you know,
yeah, I mean,
ecosystems of...
The point is, of course, that as engineers, we can basically do anything. I mean, as a biologist, you know, the only thing you can do is look at what's there, you know, biology. I mean, it changes a little bit with the genetic engineering and things like that, but basically, you know, biologists, they have the things there. And as engineers, we can basically build anything we like. And, you know, many people are trying to equip their robots, especially, I mean, you know, what's happening let's say, one of the big trends in robotics is that the robots who were originally confined to the factory floors are beginning to leave the factory floors, and they're moving into our own living space, sharing their living space with our own. Now, if you have this development, then there are interesting, let's say, ethical, legal questions that emerge. And so people are trying to equip their robots with something like a value system, but we can of course just program into the robots whatever we like. And then the question is, whether these robots will actually act ethically, or whether they will behave in similar ways that you were explaining, reciprocating or whatever. I don't think we can actually at this point really simulate the whole evolution that these behaviors will emerge just from an evolutionary process.
But it's also, if I think of evolutionary evolving robots, that could be pretty dangerous also, because evolution has produced many good things, but also many bad things. So maybe there is a mutation in these robots, so they become murderers, for example. They like to murder people or whatever. Whatever.
Well, let's say in principle that's possible, but if we look at the state of the art, we have to be honest that we're very far from. I mean, from an engineering point of view, it would be nice to be able to say, well, we're really, really advanced and we can do that, but we can't.
I would like to say something that you mentioned about the role of the body. I mean, the role of the body in social science research has been recognized in emotion research. For example, their emotions have typically a bodily expression. For example, when we are angry, we frown, okay? And so you can ask the question, well, the emotion triggers the body reaction, but it's also the other way around. For example, when we ran an experiment and we made people frown, then you can show that they respond behaviorally more like an angry person. So you can affect behavior by telling people frown. And then the muscle contraction in the below, above the eyes, seems to generate the emotion that triggers the angry behavior then. So it's really, that nicely shows that there's a reverse causality issue here that goes from the body to the emotion and not just from the emotion to the body, which came to my mind when you were talking about the role of the body. Yeah. And it's probably not only true with anger, it's only with smiling. For example, we naturally tend to smile when we see a smiling face. It's a form of contagious social process, but that automatically generates pleasant feelings. And it's also, so if you make people smile, you generate pleasant feelings in them.
Yeah, I think communication is actually embodied. It's very strongly embodied. It's not, a lot of it is not very cognitive. There is an anthropologist in Vienna, Karl Grummer, and he makes very nice experiments. He studies, among other things, first encounters. So he has a male person and a female person come to the laboratory, and they meet in the laboratory for the first time. And then by studying just the posture of the male participant, it's unbelievable what he can predict. He can predict with over 80% accuracy, I don't know the exact figures, whether the two will meet again later on, for example. Just the body posture. He doesn't need to know what they say. He doesn't need to know the facial expression. He doesn't need to know the gestures. Just the body posture of the male is sufficient to predict that. So there's an enormous amount of information or communication which is actually in the body. So I think the role, we can hardly overestimate the role of the body in behavior, also in social behavior.
Well, so you've told me that you have developed some robots, especially Roboy. who have become very good at mimicking human emotion. So you look at their face and it looks like they're happy, it looks like they're sad, they're very expressive. Do you think that they can, that you can have some of this reciprocal learning? Do you think that Roboy can learn what the expressions that he's mimicking actually mean? Is emotion kind of a frontier that we can ever expect robotics to be able to?
What is an emotion in a robot?
Okay, it's a good question. Let me just maybe I have a video here. This is Roboy. Also, I have some postcards here if you like postcards.
You can take Roboy home with you.
Yeah, you can take that home with you. So one aspect of emotion is the expression of emotion. Another point is, of course, whether the robot actually has emotion or not. I mean, it's the same question whether humans, I mean, how do I know that you have emotions?
Well, there is a
or just pretend to have emotions?
That's a good question. That's, for example, psychopaths are very good in mimicking emotions. But so that in this sense, the computer is a psychopath because because an emotion has a valence. You see, typically it has there's something valent attached to it, good or bad, or good feeling or bad feeling, and that was my question, so to speak. You can mimic, of course, the facial features of the emotion, but the valence, you see, that it really feels good or feels bad, that's probably not part of it.
Mm. Well, I don't know. For example, I have a needle and I pinch you with a needle and then you say, ouch. How do I know that you actually feel the pain and don't just pretend to feel the pain by saying ouch?
I look at your brain.
Well, no, it's interesting because you do that work, that pain work.
You can do. I mean, for example, there are clear brain signals associated with pain. We know the pain matrix. That's very well studied, the pain matrix. So if I stick a needle into your hand, I know where in the brain it lights up, so to speak, what brain networks are involved. And
put down all sharp objects.
You can't mimic that probably. You don't have control over your brain network.
That's true, yeah. Okay, well, anyhow, so here's a facial expression in the robot.
Hey, listen. I want to show you how I can feel. I can be happy. I can be shy. I can be surprised. Ooh. I can be angry. I can blink with my eye.
Okay, I think that's probably enough for the moment. Okay. So it's the expression now about the valence. I think it's a very good point. So there is a Japanese research group at Waseda University in Tokyo, and they said, okay, emotions are very much tied to our own physiology, right, to the sort of biological physiology. And maybe if we can find an equivalent, let's say a robot equivalent of biological physiology in robots, it would make sense to talk about robot emotions. They will be different, but it would make sense to talk about that. For example, you look at the battery charge, and you say, well, that's roughly the equivalent of blood sugar level, right? If it goes down too much, then you have to start worrying about getting nutrition and sort of increasing the blood sugar level again. Same battery charge goes down, the robot has to start worrying about recharging the battery, and then its priorities will change in behavior. You ask and say, well, fetch me a beer from the fridge. It will say, no, I have to charge my battery first. And another point would be you have something like operating temperature. If the operating temperature goes up, it gets too hot, we sort of take off some clothes or something like that. The robot would have to maybe slow down in what it's doing or turn on a fan or something, because if it doesn't do that, a board might actually burn out and it won't be able to move its arm anymore. So it will incur a damage if it doesn't do anything about it. And so, or the, let's say, the level, if it's squeaking, the level of lubrication of the joints might be related to pain or something like that. And so you could talk about physiological equivalence of actually mechanical systems, and then it might actually make sense to talk about robot emotions.
That's interesting. Well, one of the things that I was imagining is, one of your robots playing one of your economics games of, fairness and competition, and seeing how, how the robot versus a human are going to be learning differently in those circumstances. So you can imagine, a robot playing a typical tit-for-tat strategy. So whatever, their opponent does, or their other robot or the human, they'll respond in kind. And we know that, emotion can, in humans, enter into the picture where they're feeling, particularly vindictive or happy, and they're able to move that equilibrium in a way that I don't think robots would ever move if they're completely rule-based. So I'm wondering if you think that robots can be useful in studying these sorts of games, and I'm wondering if you think.
Well, we use sometimes computer programs, so you play against a computer program, but that's not a robot. I think evolutionary theory in my field is basically kind of applied mathematics, where you build formal models of where you program a strategy, for example, tit for tat, and then you see, or let's say it arises through mutation, and then you see how it evolves over time, and this is already quite complicated. So I don't think that adding the complications of emotions and things like that would help us at this point in time, although we believe, of course, that certain strategies that we model in our mathematical models, that they are in practice associated with emotions. For example, take again tit for tat. So, I mean, it basically could mean one instantiation, one emotional instantiation of tit for tat could be, if you do something nice to me, I feel gratitude. So I do something nice, and that induces me to do something nice to you. If you do something hostile to me, it creates anger, and that triggers, so to speak, a hostile response in me. So I believe that these strategies, they are incorporated. They are basically, we distinguish here between the ultimate mechanism and the proximate mechanism. The proximate mechanism is probably working through emotions. The ultimate evolutionary, so to speak, program that generates these strategies is looking just at replication and what is successful evolutionarily. In this sense, I mean, this is one of the biggest problems in evolutionary theory, I believe. How do you get from the ultimate to the proximate? This is a very hard problem that's basically unsolved, I believe.
Yeah, there I could imagine that actually simulation. I mean, robots, when we do evolutionary robotics, we always have the problem that we need populations. I mean, evolution only works with populations, not with individual robots. So we need a population of robots, and whoever has worked with robots knows that they most of the time they don't work properly. And so, you need to make, if you want to have 50 robots that actually work, you need to have at least 100 or 200 to have these 50 working. And then you need these populations. And then you need to change them, right? I mean, they need to be able to change by mutation. And if you have actual physical robots, that's very hard to do, at least at this state of development of the technology. So what we do is we simulate evolution.
You simulate.
But I think actually simulations could,
But that's what we do
be
too.
interesting, right?
This is all. I mean, the model, if it gets too complicated, you start simulating. So you compute, and because you can't solve it otherwise. So we use simulations too. Yeah.
Yeah. So before I open it up to the floor, can I just ask one final question? When you're talking about these sorts of dynamics, if you're a human, you can see that you will have, some sort of ultimate motivation or motivations that kind of impact the way you act. For instance, this person might be mean, and yet you want to preserve a nice reputation, so you're not going to reciprocate meanness, you're going to be nice. You'll have these reputational concerns, you'll have future concerns. How do you mimic that in a robot? How do you create motivation in a robot?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that's a good question, and there's no sort of generally accepted answer. I mean, what people try to do is that they program something like a value system into the robots. And, as I was mentioning before, part of that value system could be that the battery charge, always has to be at a certain level. And if it goes down, below a certain level, that has to be given priority over other things, Normally, you could say, well, if a human asks the robot to do something, it should do that. But if the battery level is too low, or if some other, adverse thing is happening in the environment, it might have to give priority to the other thing. And so we have to, as engineers, think about what might be sort of situations, and what the robot should do in what situations. And that also then, of course, implies that we have to think ethically, so we basically have to program ethical principles into the robots, and that should be part of their value system. And I think that's especially important if the robots are beginning to share, as what that's happening now, as they're beginning to share their living space with our own, live together with us.
Mm-hmm. So now we'll open it up to questions from the audience. There are 2 mics, one on each side, so if you line up, we'll...
Hi. Hello. I have a question about ethical systems. So you just mentioned how robots may have to have certain ethical principles programmed into them. For example, if you read Isaac Asimov, I, Robot, he talks about how a robot should never be able to hurt a human, and it's a very submissive model in some ways. But could you also see a future in which robots become very intelligent, almost equivalent to a human being, in which case we may have to start to assign rights to those robots, where they become, maybe not equivalent to us, but where, there needs to be some, some level of rights that they may have?
Okay, I think it's a very good question. So you can imagine, so one of the things that we're interested in is learning. And so we want our robots to learn rather than program. That's also a big trend now in robotics. Now you can imagine if you had a robot that could learn in the interaction with the environment autonomously, then it would sort of encounter certain situations. It would learn something in these situations, in other situations. And it would learn things, because it's autonomous, it would learn things that no other robot had learned, right? So in a sense, it will become sort of an individual. It has sort of the characteristics of an individual. And so it's, in a sense, unique. So would it then still be okay, for example, I mean, one of these ethical questions or, rights of the robots would be, would it still be okay to just pull the plug on a robot like that? And there's actually the Korean government, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, they came up with a charter for robot rights. And so, what are the rights of robots? And I think, some people, I mean, I think at the moment it's just an intellectual game that we're playing here. But, in the future it's not quite absurd, even though I think, I'm slightly skeptical about these scenarios. And one of the reasons I'm slightly skeptical about these scenarios is economic reasons. If we look at these, highly complicated, like humanoid robots, for example, Roboy, it's a very complicated, it's one of the most complicated humanoid robots that there is. It's very fragile. It was very expensive to develop. It requires a lot of maintenance. Its learning abilities are very limited. And if you think about a human being, I mean, we can do many different things. But for each individual thing that we can do, for example, driving a screw or something, or sewing, there is a machine that can do it better, more reliably, cheaper, more precisely, and there is no wear, it doesn't tire. And so, but that's an individual task. I mean, what we're good at is sort of integrating everything. We can do many different things, but basically we can do nothing really well. And so from an economic perspective, it might not be, but the market will decide. I mean, I'm convinced that the market will decide in the end. It might not be the best strategy to build these highly sophisticated, complex, fragile, expensive robots, but rather focus on the individuals, on the strengths of, more simple robots. I'm convinced that we will have a lot of robots, but maybe they're more like specialized machines rather than, these humanoid robots.
Do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I haven't thought much about this. So I'm not an expert.
Well, you can start thinking about psychopath robots. Do they get the same rights? Yes, sir.
I very much enjoyed this discussion. When Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, found out that she was being spied on, she came up with the remark. She said that just because, with respect to technology, we can do it, doesn't mean that we should do it. And with respect to robots, are we not playing with fire in terms of, for example, many years ago, Hans Moravec, who was a roboticist, said that we're creating something that will occupy the same evolutionary niche that we do, and that bit by bit, robots are advancing exponentially in their powers. Shouldn't we, in terms of looking long-term, why are we doing this? Are we replacing ourselves as a species? And bit by bit in terms of jobs, with self-driving cars, robotic surgeons, robotic nurses, caretakers.
So
these things need to be looked at. So I don't.
Do you have a point of view? And also, it's interesting to get a point of view from outside of robotics as well.
Well, my view is that they are a good thing as long as they serve us. And I think I don't see the dangers that you just mentioned. I think this is utopia, what you mentioned. I know there are movies where the robots take over. Dystopia. But as long as, they are our creatures, and I think we can draw the plug. So basically, as long as we have this control, I don't see these dangers. I mean, there will always be technologies who have dangers. There are, of course, technologies. Atomic energy can be quite dangerous. We've talked about Chernobyl, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't go forward. That means we have to have checks and balances, and that, that's basically my viewpoint.
Well, you asked many interesting questions. Let me just reply to one of them, and that is the jobs. Robots taking away people's jobs. There are many people talk about that, and depending on who you ask, you will get a different answer to the question. So some people say, yes, we will lose jobs. We have been losing jobs.
But that's a good thing. If robots do our jobs, we can spend our energies on other things.
Right. And also, right, exactly. And also there are also studies that demonstrate that, maybe locally in a particular area, jobs are lost. But overall, maybe a lot of new jobs are also created through the advancement of technology. And then there is, especially concerning robots, I think a very interesting point is the following. especially American companies, but also European companies, have in the past had a strategy of outsourcing production to cheap labor countries. Even now, I think a lot of Apple products, the iPad, the iPhone, are produced by Foxconn in China with human labor. Now, had they, and there are studies that demonstrate that actually there were hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs lost in the United States because of this outsourcing. Had they increased the level of automation, then they would have been, remained competitive in the market and could have maintained the workplaces, or at least many of the workplaces. Of course, some would have been lost, but they would have been competitive. So in the long term, I think they could have maintained the workplaces. So depending on how you look at it, you will come up with a different answer. Now, what's happening now is that Foxconn, over the last, there was announced about 2.5 years ago,
3 million robots.
3 million robots, right? 3 million robots. Well, they're produced by themselves, but so they're increasing the level of automation. And by the way, they're programmed by Google. So they're increasing the level of automation in China because now the one-child policy and a lack of qualified labor is really beginning to have an effect on the market. And so it's no longer a strategy, an easy strategy to just outsource production. I think we need to have more robots that do the jobs for us.
Thank you.
So thank you also for an interesting panel. A question for Dr. Fehr. When the question of altruism, reciprocal altruism, and evolutionary theory, of course, Darwin thought that real altruism could not be possible, and yet cooperation plays an enormous role in evolution. So far, the cells in my body are cooperating with me here tonight, and we're not really in competition. So my question is, what happens if we privilege cooperation over competition in the evolutionary drama, and how would that change our understanding of evolution, behavioral economics, evolutionary psychology?
Well, I believe that, there will always, evolution will not stop. And more successful behaviors, more successful traits will evolve, but what is more successful depends also on the environment, on society. And so just looking at a model of biological evolution is, in my view, too narrow. I give you one example. In our societies, there are many things that we punish, we discipline wrongdoers, and in the long run, this disciplining of wrongdoers leads to different behaviors, and leads to a different evolutionary path, I believe. And so, cultural evolution and biological evolution, they are interacting with each other, and it's true. We still don't fully understand where does cooperation come from. So there has been a huge so group selection has the idea that groups compete, and because, let's say, an altruistic group is more successful, altruism will evolve. That has been fallen in this respect for good reasons, but now it's resurrecting at a more sophisticated level, and we start to learn that there are multiple levels of evolution. There is evolution occurring at the individual. There's individual selection, but there are probably also some components of group selection at work. For example, we have an unpublished paper which we hope to be able to publish soon, where we show that when you add group selection to other evolutionary mechanisms, then it generates a huge push towards the evolution of altruism and cooperation wherever you add it. For example, I talked at the beginning about the breakdown of cooperation under reciprocal altruism. When we add group selection to that and the two mechanisms can interact, then cooperation again starts to flourish. And so I think what science will do in this field is we will study the interaction of different mechanisms.
Great.
I have a question to two questions. Professor Fehr, could you tell us something about corrupt politicians? Does corruption lead to becoming a politician or the other way around? And what can you say about cultural evolution in this context? And Professor Pfeifer, if you could tell us something about the uncanny valley. Well, you'll explain what it is.
Okay, so, well, corruption is a fascinating topic because, of course, we have corruption still in our societies, but if you look at our societies, we have also built many checks and balances against corruption. For example, most people would probably agree that if you, let's say, if you would go to Iraq, that's probably a more corrupt society because the whole cooperative infrastructure that you need to wipe out corruption doesn't work. For example, and I always wondered how did we ever manage to get out of corruption? So that I think that's the really puzzling thing. If the judges are corrupt, if the police is corrupt, if everybody is corrupt, how did a society ever get out of corruption? That's a real puzzle. That's the same puzzle like the evolution of, because not being corrupt when it pays to be corrupt is like being an altruist, you see. So how did we ever get out of this state of corruption?
You have an answer?
I don't have an answer. I'm fascinated by the question. I only know that we have, and you asked one question, does politics make people corrupt or do corrupt people enter politics? Well, both is probably true. Because when you have an industry, whatever the industry is, where you can easily cheat other participants in that industry, that attracts people who like to cheat, okay? But it also induces people who have been honest and were staying in the industry to also start cheating at the time. Because they don't want to be the idiot, the only one who doesn't, so they don't want to be exploited, you see. And so you have both a kind of a selection effect and a treatment effect that comes here. But getting out of corruption is as difficult a question as how it could ever happen. For example, when I always think about these judges in Italy that fight the mafia. Many of them died. They were just killed by the mafia. Why is there always another judge coming and fighting against the mafia? Yeah. And in many societies, you got out of that mafiosi state. And I think it's much more interesting to study why we have so little corruption in some of our societies than we still have some remnants of corruption. I think that's a fascinating question where I don't have a good answer. So.
Okay, so something somewhat different about this uncanny valley. So the uncanny valley basically goes back to a Japanese researcher, and he said, as long as robots are clearly identifiable as machines, I really clearly know this is a robot, then the interaction with the robot is okay for us. If the robot begins to get more and more similar to a human being, the more similar it gets, the more we feel uneasy when interacting with this robot. And you can really feel that. I mean, there's a Japanese researcher, Hiroshi Ishiguro at Osaka University, and he, built, for example, a clone of himself, and he works also together with Disney, and they build, really robots that really resemble human beings. And they're not autonomous, so there's, it's not the scenario that you pointed out, but they're remote controlled. But they look awfully like human beings. We feel uneasy. Now, the hypothesis of the uncanny valley is that, they get closer, then we feel uneasy, but then the hypothesis, and this hasn't been verified, is that if it gets even more close to a human being, also in the behavior, then we're beginning to feel at ease again, because then we think maybe it's a human being. You know, think of Blade Runner or any of these movies. Now, this is just a hypothesis that hasn't been verified. For me, the consequence is that if we build a humanoid robot like Roboy, it's very cute. I mean, people love to interact with it. The kids love the robot. I mean, we've had it all over the world. It's been in all the media, including Financial Times, and it's been on the NASDAQ website. And so people really like it. It's humanoid. It's clearly humanoid. But it's like a cartoon. In a sense, we project our own emotions into it, but it's clearly recognizable as a robot. And I think that's what people like. They want to see, it's a robot. I mean, you don't confuse Roboy with a human being. It's not possible. It's sufficiently different. So I think if we build robots, even humanoid robots, we should build them such that they're clearly recognizable as robots.
This is a question for Dr. Fehr. When you mention about the evolution of economics, or the science of economics has not been limited only by home economics, as you mentioned at the beginning, but also by its methods. Now, with so many analytical methods available, especially coming from computer science, from machine learning, or artificial intelligence, how do you think that that can shape the discipline? Like you mentioned that you make simulations, you use some type of method very close to this field for that. How do you see that can influence the whole field of economics?
Yeah, so a famous Nobel Prize winner once said something like, if you want to change economics, you have to show that you can solve an important problem with the new method. And I think that's it. So, and the question is, to what extent can we solve important problems with these new technologies? I think they come into economics now. We have these massive data problems in economics as well, and then things like machine learning, they start, for example, or other tools, they start becoming useful for us. How they change the substance in the sense of, you see, one thing is method, and the other thing is what does it generate. And it's not easy to predict what it generates. It generates additional insights, but what will be these insights? I don't know. I think it's like the behavioral economics revolution. I think there it was understanding human behavior better, really looking at behavior and not just assuming that people optimize. Brought some progress, of course, and helped us, is now helping us to design different policies to improve the situation. But how these new technologies in computer science, I think there has been one big objection in economics against numerical methods or simulations. It's this objection that you can show too much, in a sense, that you are unconstrained in your way of showing things. For example, you can program individual behaviors in infinitely many ways. And that gives you, in a sense, infinitely many degrees of freedom to generate aggregate patterns of behavior, like for the macroeconomy. So you need to constrain the technology, in a sense, also, in order to make it useful. And I think that did not happen sufficiently in numerical, when people use simulations in economics.
Go ahead.
I was curious, when you were saying that you program cognition from the bottom up as opposed to the top down, I'm wondering whether that makes it a little bit less flexible. Because, I mean, if you're basing cognition based on the body, in some ways, does it make it seem like it's limited by like our body or whatever body you can program, as opposed to when you go from the top up, let's say you have cognition that goes into the internet. There's no body, so that you wouldn't need to have to think about how the hand interacts with the cup, as opposed to how does the brain interact with the information in the abstract. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah. it depends on what your goals are. So if your goals are to understand natural forms of cognition, how something like human cognition or human intelligence has evolved, then I think you do need a bottom-up approach. If your goal is to develop a useful application or useful applications, then in, for example, industrial robotics or so, then you may not want to have a bottom-up approach, because then you already have an idea of how you want to actually solve the problem. Now, the reason, I mean, you said, well, lack of flexibility. I think that's true. If you look at, to some extent, if you look at the development of human cognition, you know, babies, for example, in babies, you know, how babies grow from a baby to an adult, then this is all, or a lot of it, let's put it this way, a lot of it is bottom-up, at least at the very beginning, right? It's interacting physically with the environment, just exploring. And then there is another component that has not been very well studied, and that is, for example, how they actually learn from, you know, adults. Well, what's been studied to quite some extent is imitation, you know, imitation. So that's something. But that's, you know, and then there is, of course, interaction, there is language and things like that. And language has that sort of level of abstraction that I guess you're looking for, which makes cognition much more general and in some sense, to some extent, independent of the body. Having said that, there is a lot of work that demonstrates that language, the development of language, is actually very closely related to the specific way our body is formed, and also higher levels of cognition. There's a very provocative book by Lakoff and Johnson. Lakoff, I think, linguist, philosopher from Berkeley. Lakoff and Nunez, Rafael Nunez from San Diego. And they have this book, a really beautiful, provocative book called Where Mathematics Comes From. And they argue I think it was about 2000 when it came out, they argue that the way even very abstract concepts like, for example, transitivity or the notion of a limit have their origin in the way our bodies are physically built, and they could not have been conceived differently. I mean, it's a hypothesis, but they have a lot of evidence based on the ideas of metaphors, you know, bodily metaphors, you know, up and, you know, down, up is good, and there. I mean, it's an open debate, but I really do think that we need, if we really want to understand even abstract thinking, we need to look at development from the bottom up. And let me just give an example. We work with a developmental psychologist from Indiana University, Linda Smith, and she does experiments with kids. And she said, okay, I can give you an embodied notion of transitivity. So we give a kid a container, and then we'll give it a smaller container. And he or she will put the smaller container into the bigger container. And then we give them yet a smaller container, and then they will put the yet smaller container into the sort of intermediate container, and then they will immediately detect that the smallest container is also contained in the biggest one. So there you have an embodied notion of the abstract concept of transitivity. So maybe the two are not all that far apart as we might think. So, but I mean, what you are asking is basically a whole research program. You know, it's kind of
Sorry. So we have time for one more question, sir, since you've been waiting since the beginning.
Okay. I've heard and read that robots and automation will replace 50% of the jobs which now exist in a relatively short time. So I'm curious when that will happen. That's one question. And the second has to do with who controls and who profits from the robots. And that ties in with the capital in the 21st century.
I think that's a
That's-
question
yeah.
for the
Please.
economist.
It's for both
Dr.
of you.
Fehr.
Yeah, that's an
No,
interesting
but
question.
when will the robots replace 50% of the jobs that now exist? And who profits from it?
So the first question is for him. The second question is for me. So I think that there is good reason to believe that some of the inequality that has been generated, income inequality, is due to technical progress. So that some skills have been extremely strongly rewarded by the market, whereas others haven't. And so you have a growing inequality.
Big disconnect.
Yeah, and well, that's why we need societal institutions that rebalance things. And I think I have the feeling that Europe has been better in this respect than the US. And I think it's a good thing that the inequality is again comes to the political agenda. It has to come, and but it's not clear how we can rebalance it in an efficient way. You see, for example, when you talk about capital in the 21st century,
You've heard of the book.
yeah, of course. When you think of a wealth tax, an international wealth tax, that probably takes another 50 years, if at all, if it will ever happen. So we may need to think about other tools than that to achieve the goals of reducing inequality. I think, you see, in principle, technical progress is a good thing.
Yes.
It's a good thing. It relieves us from burdens, okay? Now, the question is just how do we distribute the benefits? And that's why we need political. There's just no way that we can escape the idea that we need some form of political intervention into the process. And but how that should be designed is not yet clear.
Okay, let me just briefly comment on the first part of the question. I basically believe that, sort of reiterating on what Ernst Fehr was saying, that phrasing it a little more provocatively, I think what can be automated should be automated. Now, it depends. Now, the predictions that some people make in saying 50 years or in some years 50% of the job.
20 years.
That depends on what scenarios you believe in. Yeah. So, for example, two economists, I think they were from MIT, they said, we have self-driving cars. Now, with self-driving cars, okay, we may not need drivers anymore, bus drivers, there are millions of them, they will lose their job. Also, what they say is it's even worse than that. We will have less accidents, fewer accidents in the future. Traffic will become much more safe, which means that we will need fewer surgeons, we need fewer personnel in the hospitals. The garages, the repair shops, they have less work, and these people will be out of job. So pointing this out as a bad thing, right? And if you believe this scenario, and they say, well, we'll need fewer hospitals. If you believe this scenario, then in some areas jobs will be lost, but in other areas this has always been the case. A lot of new jobs and maybe even more interesting jobs have actually been created. So, I mean, these are scenarios that you believe in or don't believe in, and you can argue for this or for that. And I would like to sort of to end the statement with a quote by also a Nobel Prize in physics, though, Niels Bohr, and he said, "It's hard to predict, especially the future."
Okay, I agree.
On that note, thank you both so much for joining us. I think this was really a fascinating discussion.